Okay, greetings everybody. Welcome to the next session on these mini lectures on the international development for the mini masters program. Okay, today I wanted to talk a little bit about the paradigms of development. So we've talked about where the idea of development came from, and one of the crucial things I wanted to leave from that session was the idea of exporting the Marshall Plan, infrastructure, technology, training, and credit to the poor countries of the world. So the success of the Marshall Plan in Europe led to this idea of saying, hey, let's use it, let's apply it elsewhere. I also did a short description of who are the players on the development scene now. I mean, there's been considerable growth since the end of World War II on who is involved in development. And now we're at a place where there are literally millions of organizations doing this, and I wanted to outline the different categories of players and their different motivations to help understand a little bit some of the potential conflicts or discomforts people might experience when trying to work across different levels. Now today what I wanted to do was talk a little bit more, so before you start your readings, about the paradigms of development. Now, what a paradigm is a complicated term to basically mean what are the explanations for why poverty exists. In other words, what are the explanations for why people are poor, or what are the explanations for why governments or nations are poor. And there's actually many different types of explanations. They fall into generally roughly three categories of theories, which I'll describe here and which one of your readings describes in more detail. But I wanted to give this a sort of a overview before you start your reading. Throughout this class, there's two organizing concepts that I wanted to really highlight as we go through our readings. The first concept is, how do we think about the causes of poverty? I know that we're always supposed to reflect on that in World Vision. I don't think we always do it very well. Sometimes we all just say the same thing, nod our heads, and don't really ask the question of, is our explanations for the causes actually correct? Do they draw on the right assumptions? Do they look at the right things? So I wanted to show that there's like three different major categories of how people think about the causes. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is, as an organizing concept, is this idea of unintended consequences. Throughout the history of development over the last 70 years or so, there have been many, many examples of good intentions actually making things worse. And one of the other lecture sessions highlights a very famous example with the Green Revolution. So one of the things I think that as a development worker we need to pay attention to is, how do we minimize the possible negative consequences of the way that we work. Another famous example, I'm going to highlight it here, is from the example of the churches of the United States and the negative unintended consequences that occurred during the presidency of John F. Kennedy with respect to Haiti. I'll very quickly describe the story, but it's sort of an example. So John F. Kennedy was a president of the United States in the 1960s, early 1960s. And one of his speeches, he made a comment about how the people of Haiti are so poor that they can hardly afford to buy their own clothes, that they have no clothes or no new clothes. Many of the churches of the time sort of rallied around this idea. They were like, let's help clothe the people of Haiti. And they organized many, many different initiatives to get used clothing, to get people to donate clothes that they weren't using any longer. And they sent all these clothes to Haiti to distribute to the poor people in Haiti, which sounds like a good idea, right? It was good intentions. One of the unintended consequences, though, that people realized later was that this influx of all this clothing into the market in Haiti basically put all of the local tailors out of business. Nobody wanted to buy clothes made by tailors in Haiti because it cost a lot when there was all this free clothes coming in from North America. So all the tailors went bankrupt, basically, and put out of business. Even the clothing factories that did exist in Haiti shut down, and all those people were fired. So one of the, in a sort of a brutal way of saying it, sending all these clothes to Haiti actually increased the number of poor people in the country, because it put a lot of people who did have jobs as tailors or working in the clothes factories out of work. So it's those kinds of unintended consequences that that are negative that we need to pay a lot of attention to in development. And the paradigms that we use in development, some of them have more or less negative unintended consequences. So this is a major organizing concept I want to walk us through as we look at the rest of the class period as well. Okay, now back to paradigms of development. I think a simple way of doing this, I'm going to start with why are people poor? Now, the paradigms of development are really talking about why are countries poor, but there's a lot of equivalence. So if I were to ask you, why is so-and-so poor? If you point to somebody on the street, let's say a Roma family, there's usually three types of ways that you would respond. The first is a whole category of things I call individual-focused explanations. So you might say things like, well, they just don't have what it takes. They're biologically incapable of being rich. Not too many people say that anymore, but this used to be a very popular description in the early 1900s for why there were poor people around the world. Or you might say they're cultural. They have the wrong cultural values. We have to teach them the right values. Positive parenting, positive discipline, child empowerment, and then they will not be poor. You might also say something about religious. Maybe you say they're sinful, they need salvation, and if they had salvation, they would develop. Or you might say miscellaneous, like they just lack the skills. If you train them in the right skills, they won't have to be poor anymore. So, but all of these explanations really target the poor person. They say it's something about the person that is lacking, and that's what makes them poor. Whether it's biological, whether it's cultural, whether it's religious, or whether it's just skills-based, it's the poor person's fault in some ways that they're poor. The second category of explanations would be called structural explanations. And there's two types of responses. What the structural explanations say is it's not really the fault of the poor person. They're caught in a system that traps them in poverty. So you wouldn't necessarily do a training to a person if they're trapped in a system. You would actually have to look at the system itself. So structural explanations fall into two different sort of approaches. Part one is sort of a lack of opportunity. They just don't have, they have the right desires, values, motivations, but they don't have access to, or they don't have the opportunities to progress. A classic example from this would be something called the cycle of poverty, which basically, I'll outline it here really quickly, but it says that people are trapped in poverty over generations because of certain things in the system. So let's say, for example, let's say you're a poor person, you can't afford to go to a good school, so you end up having a poor education. If you have a poor education, you end up having limited skills. If you have limited skills, then you probably don't have too many good job opportunities. If you don't have very many good job opportunities, then you probably end up with a low income. If you have a low income, you have to live in a poor neighborhood. Well, poor neighborhoods tend to have limited infrastructure. Limited infrastructure means that they tend to have poor schools. And if you have poor schools, it means you have a poor education. And then you end up with your kids going through the same cycle that you did. So when people say that the explanation for poverty, for why people are poor, is that they lack the opportunity, often what they're trying to do is break something inside this cycle of poverty, either by increasing education or skills or job opportunities or income. But there's something that they're trying to do to break this cycle of poverty. You'll often hear people use that term. The second category of why people are poor that's structural is basically that because they're being exploited by somebody else. They're being taken advantage of. Either because of nasty individuals. So this one that says elite hegemony is basically saying, there's a group of people who are elites who have taken advantage of poor people for their own benefit. Um, or another sort of explanation is the system itself requires some people to be poor, and this benefits the entire system. So, for example, capitalism. Everybody talks about the joys of capitalism, but one of the things economists get very, very nervous when the unemployment rate gets too close to zero. The capitalist system, only works if there's a certain amount of people who are unemployed. If you gave everybody a job, the system would collapse. Now, there's some complicated reasons for this, but it's not one of the things that people normally talk about when they talk about the joys of capitalism. It's the joys of capitalism, except for that 4 to 10% of people who need to be unemployed. Doesn't matter which 4 to 10%, but there have to be 4 to 10% in order for the system to work. So, in this second category, the structural explanations, you either look at lack of opportunity or you look at people are being taken advantage of. And that's why there's poverty. Now, the international development paradigms, they're talking about nations here rather than people, but they would have similar sort of equivalents to, I was trying to show like the simple explanations. Now here are the more, here's what the theories would say about nations, why nations are poor. And these three paradigms roughly fall into the three categories I described. So either a nation is poor because of something the nation itself lacks, either the right values or systems or culture, or the nation is poor because it lacks opportunity, or the nation is poor because it's being exploited. So the technical names for these three paradigms are modernization theory, growth with equity theory, and liberation theory. Now, let me just quickly highlight modernization theory. I only want to keep these lectures to about 15 minutes. So, modernization theory is the big one. This is the original theory that guided all development practice, and it's still the most common theory in place. I'll explain what modernization theory sort of says, but when I talked about exporting the Marshall Plan to poor nations, that falls under this paradigm. So infrastructure, training, technology, credit, those are very modernization theory types of descriptions. Now, Edwin Rostow was one of the earliest theorists of modernization theory, and what he basically says is that all nations go through a process. They go from pre-modern societies, which don't have the right systems and values, to pre-takeoff societies that are in transition, to takeoff societies where like suddenly there's this massive social transformation that occurs, and then you end up with a modern society at the end of the process. So one of the key things about modernization theory is that it tends to see people or nations and poor people moving through stages of evolution that are not necessarily inevitable, but what you're trying to do in development is have them move through these stages faster. Almost all of the government language in Albania, when they're talking about Albania with respect to Europe or elsewhere, whether you're from the left or from the right, they all use this type of language when they talk about how Albania has transformed itself since the end of communism. It's a very modernization type of discourse in Albania. Now, just to summarize modernization theory very quickly, modernization theory basically says what you have to do if you want to make a nation wealthy is establish the right social institutions and develop the right values for managing these institutions. Now, when they mean social institutions, they essentially mean these five things. You have a capitalist economic system, you have a democratic political system, you have an efficient bureaucratic governmental system. Now, this one always confuses people sometimes because they say, "Isn't government, bureaucracy is bad, right?" And it's like, not necessarily. An inefficient bureaucracy is bad, but the idea of a bureaucracy is actually considered a modern institution, because what a bureaucracy really is a system to treat everybody equal. So nobody gets special favors. Now, we know that always never works, But the idea of a modern bureaucracy is that everybody is treated the same. In the social sphere, you tend to highlight rational individualism. So, a logical, thoughtful, engaged citizen is an important idea in modernization theory. And religion tends to be secular or humanist. In other words, the idea of religion is not considered modern in original modernization paradigm. Now, uh, there's been some modifications of that recently, but if you look at the wealthiest regions of the world, the wealthiest region of the world right now is Europe, and Europe has basically all of these characteristics, including being a very secular society. So people point to like the wealthy regions of the world that are like such as Europe, and they notice that they're more and more secular, and they say there's a link here between religion and development. Now, as I said, some of the things you'll be reading sort of challenges that a little bit, but this is what modernization theory is trying to do. Basically, is trying to say that you're aspiring to get to these systems. So, how can you tell if your organization has a modernization perspective? Well, it tends to emphasize infrastructure. So you build roads, dams, schools, hospitals, churches, grids. So anything that has to do with infrastructure development tends to have a modernization, would be an indicator of a modernization perspective. If you do literacy programs, that's modernization, uh, or importing technology and training people in the technology, or running demonstration farms. Youth-oriented programs, such as that are intended to provide mentoring or skills training, are a modernization type of program. In other words, you're trying to train youth in the right cultural values so that they can integrate into society. You often tend to promote scholarships for people to go to universities in the United States or Europe. And foreign personnel often play key roles in the programs. Now, in the literature, uh, also you tend to, well, if you're in a modernization organization, you would tend to emphasize setting up strong institutions, whether judicial, legislative, political, but you talk a lot about you want to have the right institutional structure and systems. And you would tend to use words like less developed nations, developing nations, emerging nations, or you might use terms like capacity building, transfer of technology, and there's a strong emphasis on growth. Like what you're trying to do is get the society to grow. Again, think about Albania's sort of government language around sort of the joys of growth and the importance of growth to become like Europe, right? Sita Jith Europa. Um, so modernization theory is, as I said, it was the original sort of paradigm that people used in development, and it was it's still a very dominant one in the sense of a lot of organizations when they first engage in development, they tend to use this kind of language. Also, probably 75% of all of the funding that is available for development work is probably embedded in a modernization approach. So it's still a very common paradigm. However, there have been many criticisms of modernization theory because of some of the unintended consequences that have occurred because of the way that modernization theory was implemented. And my next session, which is on Juan Valdez and the Green Revolution, highlights some of the sort of conundrums or inconsistencies that have occurred as a result of implementing modernization theory. And so we'll talk more about that in the next. I'll highlight that, and then I'll show how the criticisms of modernization theory gave rise then to responses that are embedded in the other paradigms. And so this is where the other paradigms emerged, was really as a criticism of or as a response to some of the shortcomings that were seen in modernization theory. Okay, now the reading will also have a lot more of these descriptions. This is supposed to be just a very general introduction, but hopefully I didn't get you too lost in this. All right, over and out.